As he stood on the steps of the courthouse, Sarah beside him, the weight of everything that had happened settled over him. The years of injustice, the lies, the betrayal, it was all behind them now. But what lay ahead was a future full of possibilities. They had survived, they had won. And just when it seemed that everything had been resolved, the final twist came. It was a call from the lawyer who had represented Sarah during the trial. She had something important to share. The lawyer's voice was calm, but there was an edge of something else, something unsettling. "We've uncovered something new," the lawyer said. "A final piece to the puzzle. It's about the people who helped Pierce on the inside. We have their names, but this changes everything." Aaron's heart skipped. Was it possible that even after everything they had been through, there was more to uncover? As he stood in that moment, a sense of unease crept over him. The battle had been won, but it seemed like the war was far from over. Pierce might have been brought down, but Aaron knew all too well that corruption didn't die easily. It lingered in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to rise again. For now, though, Aaron allowed himself a moment of peace. The fight had been long, the odds had been stacked against him, but the truth had set him free. And in the end, that was all that mattered. As the sun set over the courthouse, Aaron turned to Sarah. "It's not over yet," he said quietly. But for now, at least they had won. Imagine this. You're on a flight, ready to settle into your seat and relax, but what happens next completely shocks you. A man, visibly annoyed, suddenly demands that a black surgeon move out of first class and give up her seat. Why? Because he doesn't believe someone like her belongs there. What he doesn't know is that this is no ordinary woman. She's a highly skilled and successful surgeon who's about to deliver a response that will leave him speechless and, likely, everyone else in the cabin. It all started when Dr. Lisa Roberts, a brilliant surgeon who spent years studying and practicing medicine, finally got a chance to treat herself to a long-awaited vacation. After a grueling year in the operating room, she thought she deserved a little luxury, something most of us can relate to. She'd saved up, booked a first-class seat, and was looking forward to a peaceful, well-deserved break. But little did she know that her journey would take an unexpected turn. As she settled into her seat, headphones on, flipping through a book she'd been meaning to finish, she barely noticed the man who was already seated in the row behind her. He was one of those people who seemed to carry an air of entitlement, as though the world owed him something. The kind of man who thought the rules didn't apply to him. At first he tried to ignore her, but as the flight attendants made their rounds, serving drinks and snacks, his irritation began to rise. He looked at her again, taking in her appearance, the way she carried herself, confident, poised. And then it happened. He leaned over to the flight attendant and demanded that she move the other passengers who didn't belong in first class. The flight attendant, taken aback, was about to dismiss his complaint when he pointed directly at Dr. Roberts. "You need to get her out of here," he said loudly, his voice dripping with arrogance. "She doesn't belong in first class. She's not one of ****. The words hung in the air like a cold, uncomfortable weight. Dr. Roberts, who had already heard the subtle hint of disdain in his voice, looked up. She knew exactly what was happening. The man had no idea who she was, no idea of her journey, her struggles, or the hard-earned success she'd built over the years. But she wasn't about to let his ignorance slide. As the flight attendant hesitated, unsure of how to handle the situation, Dr. Roberts stood up and addressed the man directly. His face, full of judgment and entitlement, faltered for a brief moment as she spoke. The tension in the air was palpable. Her calm, collected voice was a stark contrast to his angry outbursts. She wasn't just a passenger being harassed. She was a person who had earned every ounce of respect in this world. But what came next was something no one could have predicted. Dr. Roberts didn't just respond to his demand. She set the record straight in a way that left the man speechless, and everyone around her in stunned silence. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. What would you do if you were in her shoes? How would you react to such blatant disrespect? especially when you've worked so hard to get to where you are. The truth is, people like Dr. Roberts don't have to prove their worth to anyone. But her response, it was about far more than just putting a rude passenger in his place. The tension in the cabin was thick as the man's face turned bright red, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't find the right words to defend himself. What happened next on that plane was nothing short of extraordinary. But here's the thing. I'm not going to spoil the rest of the story just yet. Stay tuned, because Dr. Roberts' response not only left the man speechless, it showed everyone around her what true power, grace, and dignity really look like. And trust me, when you hear what she said next, you won't believe it. Dr. Roberts had always known what it was like to be underestimated. She'd been through it all, growing up in a working-class neighborhood, watching her parents work tirelessly to make ends meet. From a young age, she was determined that she wouldn't let anyone dictate what she could or couldn't do. But even with all the success she'd built over the years, there were still moments when people tried to make her feel like she wasn't enough, that she didn't belong. It was no secret that the medical field, like many other professions, wasn't always the easiest place for a Black woman to thrive. From the moment she set foot in medical school, she was met with challenges, not just in terms of the rigorous coursework, but in how she was treated by some of her peers and even professors. There were times when she felt like she had to work twice as hard just to be seen as competent, to prove herself in ways that others never had to. But Dr. Roberts was strong. She didn't back down. In fact, she used every slight, every setback, as fuel to push herself further. And now, years later, she was a respected surgeon in a top-tier hospital, known for her skill and dedication to her patients. But what happened on that flight? That was something entirely different. It wasn't about her professional accomplishments or the hours of study that had led her to become who she was. It was about the kind of person this man thought she was, a woman who didn't fit his narrow definition of success or privilege. When Dr. Roberts had first sat down in her seat, she hadn't noticed the man behind her. She was lost in her thoughts, adjusting her seat, getting comfortable, and preparing herself for the long flight ahead. She had a few hours to unwind before the business of the day started, and this was her moment of peace. But peace was the last thing she would get that day. The flight attendant had just passed by with drinks when the man made his demand. At first, she wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. It seemed almost impossible that someone would say something so overtly rude, especially on an airplane, where everyone was supposed to be in this shared space, working together toward the same destination. But when the man raised his voice again, she realized it wasn't a misunderstanding. "Excuse me, but I think you've made a mistake," he said, his words cutting through the hum of the cabin. The flight attendants looked around, trying to figure out how to handle the situation, but the man was relentless. "She doesn't belong here," he added, his tone laced with contempt. "I've never seen someone like her in first class. Why is she sitting here?" Dr. Roberts turned in her seat, her eyes meeting his for the first time. His face was flushed, his expression one of pure disdain. It was clear he wasn't going to let this go, and from the way his jaw was clenched, she could tell that he wasn't going to apologize for what he'd said. In that moment, something clicked in her. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was a test. A test of her patience, her dignity, and her resolve. And Dr. Roberts wasn't about to fail it. She knew that this man didn't understand who she was. He couldn't possibly understand what it had taken for her to be in that seat. But instead of snapping back, instead of letting anger dictate her response, she chose to handle the situation with grace. She was done proving herself to people who didn't matter. This moment, however, wasn't about her. It was about showing him, and everyone around her, that she didn't need to meet his standards to be worthy of respect. As the flight attendant stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed, Dr. Roberts stood up, her movements slow but purposeful. The cabin fell silent, every eye now on her. The man, still fuming, watched as she walked toward the aisle. There was something about her calm demeanor that seemed to confuse him. It was as if he expected her to be angry, to argue with him. But instead, she simply said, "Sir, you seem to have a problem with my presence here. But I think the problem is not my seat, but your perception of me." For a brief moment, the man hesitated, his face twisted, not sure how to respond to her composed and thoughtful words. He had expected to encounter someone who would cower, apologize, or give him some form of justification for being where she was. But Dr. Roberts wasn't interested in justifying her existence to anyone. She had earned that seat, and more importantly, she knew that her worth didn't hinge on the approval of a stranger. She continued, her voice steady, but carrying an undeniable power. "I've worked hard for everything I have. I've spent years in medical school, countless hours in the operating room, and have saved lives in ways you'll never understand. So if you think for 1 second that my being here is a mistake, maybe you should take a closer look at yourself." The man's mouth opened, as if to respond, but no words came out. The cabin was silent, save for the soft hum of the plane. People were watching, waiting, unsure of what would happen next. They had expected a confrontation, a fight perhaps, but instead, they were witnessing something far more powerful. The man's arrogance seemed to shrink in the face of Dr. Roberts' quiet strength. But the tension wasn't over. The man, struggling to regain his composure, looked over at the flight attendants, hoping they would take his side. But the flight attendants, to their credit, remained neutral, unwilling to engage in the conflict. It was clear they saw what was happening. This wasn't just about a seating mix-up. This was about something far deeper, something that went beyond the confines of the airplane. And then, just as the man was about to speak again, a voice from the back of the plane interrupted. It was a woman, a fellow passenger who had been silently observing the exchange. "You should be ashamed of yourself," she said, her voice loud and firm. "She's more deserving of that seat than you could ever imagine. You have no idea who you're talking to." Dr. Roberts looked at the woman, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It wasn't just her words that had left the man speechless. It was the collective power of those around her, who were beginning to stand up to the toxic behavior that had filled the cabin. The power of solidarity, the power of truth. But despite the woman's support, the tension in the air remained thick. The man was not ready to back down, and neither was Dr. Roberts. The flight continued, and the unresolved conflict hung between them, leaving everyone wondering what would happen next. Would the man finally apologize, or would this be a battle that continued to unfold long after the plane landed? Would Dr. Roberts get the respect she deserved, or would she continue to face this kind of challenge from people who didn't understand what it meant to truly earn a seat at the table? As the story unfolded, one thing was certain: the journey was far from over. As the woman's voice echoed through the cabin, a palpable shift took place. The tension was still thick, but now it was more complicated. It wasn't just about Dr. Roberts and the man anymore. It was about the passengers who had become unwilling witnesses to this altercation. Some of them had shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others were watching with wide eyes, trying to make sense of what was unfolding before them. Dr. Roberts, standing tall and unwavering, glanced briefly at the woman who had spoken up in her defense. She hadn't expected someone else to get involved, but the unexpected support felt like a quiet reassurance. Still, she didn't want to make the moment into something bigger than it had to be. Her response had already been measured and firm. Now, all she wanted was peace, something she was desperately trying to find in a situation that felt increasingly out of control. The man, clearly embarrassed, but too proud to admit defeat, crossed his arms and huffed in frustration. His eyes flicked around the cabin, searching for someone, anyone, to agree with him. But it was as if the atmosphere had shifted against him. People were whispering now, but not in his favor. A few passengers exchanged glances, while others simply avoided eye contact with him, unsure of how to handle the awkwardness of the situation. "Are you really going to let her talk to me like that?" The man finally spat, his voice shaking with irritation. It wasn't even directed at Dr. Roberts anymore. It was aimed at the flight attendants, who were caught in the middle of his escalating outrage. The flight attendants exchanged glances, but neither of them moved to intervene. They had seen their fair share of disputes in the air, but this felt different. Something about the way Dr. Roberts had stood up for herself made it clear that they weren't dealing with just any passenger. She wasn't backing down, and they weren't about to pick sides. "Sir," one of the flight attendants began, her voice calm but firm, "we are here to ensure the comfort and safety of all passengers. We will not tolerate disrespect toward anyone on this flight." The words hung in the air, a quiet reminder of the rules that were supposed to govern the space they all shared. But the man, still fuming, didn't take the hint. "What's your name?" he demanded of the attendant. "I want to make a complaint about this woman." Dr. Roberts wasn't sure if he realized how absurd he sounded, but she could hear the desperation in his voice now. He was unraveling, losing control of a situation that was slipping away from him. What had started as a simple demand had escalated into something much larger, something more significant than he ever expected. And it wasn't just about his ego anymore. It was about his inability to process the fact that he had met someone who refused to be intimidated, someone who wasn't interested in playing by his rules. For a brief moment, Dr. Roberts thought about walking away, about simply letting it go. But then she remembered why she'd chosen to speak up in the first place. This wasn't just about one rude man. It was about the larger truth that people like him, people who tried to make others feel small, needed to be called out. There was power in standing up to that kind of behavior. Meanwhile, the passengers in the back of the plane continued to murmur, exchanging opinions in hushed tones. There was a sense of unease in the air, like everyone was waiting for something to happen, for someone to take a stand, for the tension to either break or boil over. It wasn't just Dr. Roberts' integrity on the line anymore. It was the collective integrity of everyone who had witnessed this exchange. It was about how people would choose to react when faced with injustice, however small it might seem. And then, almost out of nowhere, the quietest voice in the cabin spoke up again, this time from an older woman who had been sitting in the row across from Dr. Roberts. "You know," the woman said softly, but with a clarity that rang through the cabin, "I've seen this before. I've seen how some people think they have the right to decide who belongs where. It's the same attitude that's been passed down for generations. But you, young lady," she continued, turning toward Dr. Roberts with a warm smile, "you've earned your seat. You've earned every ounce of it." The woman's words seemed to have an impact that none of the previous remarks had. There was something about the simplicity of her statement, the quiet strength in her voice, that cut through the noise. The man's eyes narrowed as he realized he wasn't the only one speaking up against Dr. Roberts. The cabin had shifted again, but this time it was in her favor. For a moment, the man was speechless. His shoulders sagged slightly, and the defiance in his posture faltered. But Dr. Roberts didn't let him off the hook just yet. She wasn't going to allow him to quietly retreat from the challenge he had started. "You think I'm just a woman in first class," she said, turning back toward him, her voice steady. "But you're wrong. I am a woman in a position of authority. I'm a woman who's dedicated her life to helping others. I'm a surgeon who has saved lives, performed surgeries that you'll never have the faintest idea about. And I've worked harder than you could imagine to get to this seat. So if you think for one second that I'm going to apologize for taking my place, you're mistaken." There it was, the heart of the matter. The man had assumed that Dr. Roberts was someone who had simply stumbled into her position. He didn't understand that her success was not a fluke. It wasn't some random twist of fate that had brought her here. She had worked tirelessly, sacrificed years of her life for her career, and overcame countless obstacles along the way. Her words left a mark on the cabin, but they also left a mark on the man. He opened his mouth to respond, but once again, nothing came out. The man seemed to shrink, his arrogance slowly draining from him as the weight of his behavior hit him all at once. Still, the atmosphere was far from resolved. There was a lingering tension, as if the conflict had shifted into something deeper. It wasn't just about one rude man anymore. It was about the larger dynamics of privilege and perception, about the subtle ways people tried to keep others in their place. Dr. Roberts wasn't just confronting a single person's ignorance. She was confronting an entire mindset that had been ingrained in society for far too long. And the questions remained unanswered. Would the man finally recognize his mistake, or would he continue to cling to his misguided beliefs? And more importantly, would Dr. Roberts walk away from this, satisfied with the way she handled the situation, or would this moment stay with her, gnawing at her, a reminder of how far we still have to go? The silence that followed Dr. Roberts' words felt like an eternity, hanging in the air between her and the man who had dared challenge her. For a brief moment, no one moved. The passengers, once so absorbed in their own worlds, were now all watching, holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The flight attendants remained in their positions, but it was clear they were unsure of how to proceed. This wasn't just about a simple seating issue anymore. This was about dignity, power, and respect. The man's face had turned a shade of red that only deepened the longer he remained silent. It was as though the anger that had once bubbled up within him was now being replaced by something else. Was it shame? Regret? Or had he finally realized just how out of line he had been? Dr. Roberts stood in front of him, her posture unwavering, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a challenge. She wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. But she also wasn't expecting him to apologize. People like him didn't often see their mistakes so clearly. The tension in the cabin was thick, almost suffocating. The murmurs that had begun to die down picked up again, louder now, as people exchanged looks and whispered to one another. They were witnessing something more than just a confrontation. It felt like a moment of reckoning. A turning point. There was no going back now. The man, with his thick ego and sense of entitlement, had crossed a line, but it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever felt diminished, who had ever been told they didn't belong in spaces they had earned. And right now, Dr. Roberts wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing up for them all. The man finally opened his mouth, but his words came out stilted, unsure. I wasn't trying to offend you, he said, his voice faltering. I just thought, I didn't expect. He was fumbling now, his mind scrambling to find a way out, a way to salvage whatever dignity he had left. But it was clear that whatever he was about to say would fall short of making things right. Dr. Roberts didn't give him the satisfaction of an immediate response. Instead, she let the silence hang just a little longer, making sure that everyone in the cabin felt the weight of the moment. He was cornered, and he knew it. Then, in a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control, the man glanced at the flight attendants again, his gaze more frantic now. You need to do something about this, he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. The flight attendants exchanged a brief look, but neither of them moved to placate him. They could see this wasn't just a matter of customer service anymore. There was something bigger at play here. Dr. Roberts took a small step back, her arms still crossed over her chest. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their energy shifting, waiting to see if she would let him have the last word or if she would take control of the narrative completely. She was aware of the gravity of the situation. She wasn't just defending her seat. She was defending something much deeper, her place in the world, the right for people like her to exist unapologetically in spaces that others thought they should be excluded from. And that was when it happened. The man, unable to keep up his facade any longer, let slip something that would forever change the dynamics of this exchange. You people, he muttered under his breath, so quietly that only Dr. Roberts could hear him, but it was enough. The words, sharp and venomous, were like a slap to the face. It wasn't just about class or status now, it was about race. Dr. Roberts' eyes narrowed slightly, her focus shifting from his earlier arrogance to something far more dangerous. This wasn't just about entitlement. This was about the deep-rooted biases that many try to pretend didn't exist. The weight of his words was heavier than any insults he had thrown her way before. His attempt to belittle her had now crossed the line into something far more insidious. And it wasn't something Dr. Roberts could ignore. For a moment, she said nothing. She didn't need to. The realization was dawning on the other passengers now. Some of them gasped softly, others turned away, But the tension in the cabin had taken on a new form. It wasn't just about one man's ignorance anymore. It was about a confrontation of worldviews, a clash of attitudes that spoke to something much deeper than any of them had initially realized. The man's face twisted in frustration as he realized that his words had not only failed to hit their mark, but they had exposed the ugly side of his character. He tried to backpedal, his voice rising in pitch, but it was clear that his control was slipping away. "I didn't mean it like that," he sputtered. But Dr. Roberts wasn't listening anymore. She had heard enough. Her next words were measured, but they cut through the tension in the cabin like a knife. "You didn't have to say it out loud," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with power. "But now that you have, I'm going to say this. You don't get to define who I am. You don't get to decide where I belong. You've shown your true colors, and now the rest of us see you for who you really are." It wasn't just about the man anymore. It wasn't even about Dr. Roberts. It was about everyone who had ever been marginalized, overlooked, or dismissed. She wasn't just confronting one person's ignorance. She was confronting a system of thought that had been ingrained in society for generations. And in this moment, she was doing something that many had never done before. She was forcing that system to face the truth. The man opened his mouth again, but there was no confidence in his voice this time. No venom. He had nothing left to say. The reality of what had just transpired settled over him, like the weight of his own actions crashing down on him all at once. His face drained of color, his shoulders slumped, and for the first time in this entire exchange, he looked small, defeated. But the drama didn't end there. The passengers, once passive observers, now seemed to shift. Some had begun to whisper their support, others exchanging nods of agreement. The energy in the cabin had changed completely. The spotlight was no longer on the man, but on the idea that had come to the surface. The idea that people like Dr. Roberts weren't here by accident. They belonged here just as much as anyone else. But just as it seemed like the tension might begin to dissipate, something unexpected happened. The woman who had spoken up earlier, the one who had defended Dr. Roberts, stood up again, this time making her way toward the front of the cabin. Her eyes locked on Dr. Roberts, a look of determination in her gaze. Without saying a word, she walked down the aisle, her steps deliberate and strong. It was as if she was making a statement of her own, one that was even more powerful than any words. The moment had come. The climax of this confrontation was fast approaching, but no one knew how it would end. Would the man finally back down, realizing his defeat? Or would Dr. Roberts stand her ground, and in doing so, solidify a truth that couldn't be ignored? The entire cabin was waiting for the answer, and only one person, maybe two, knew how this was going to unfold. The woman who had stepped forward was now standing at the front of the plane, her eyes fixed on Dr. Roberts. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, anticipating the next move. It was as if the moment had expanded into something larger, something more profound than anyone had expected. The man who had caused this whole uproar was watching with narrowed eyes, clearly confused and unsettled. He hadn't expected anyone to challenge him so forcefully, and now the dynamics of the entire situation seemed to be shifting once again. But just as the woman reached Dr. Roberts, something unexpected happened. Another voice cut through the tense silence. A man in his late 30s, who had been sitting a few rows behind Dr. Roberts, suddenly stood up. He wasn't involved in the conflict until now, but the intensity of the situation seemed to pull him into the spotlight. He looked around, his gaze scanning the cabin. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice carrying over the low murmurs of the other passengers. All eyes shifted to him. Was he about to take the man's side? Would he challenge Dr. Roberts and escalate the situation further? The flight attendants stiffened, clearly unsure of what direction this new interruption would take. The man took a step forward, and the tension in the air reached a fever pitch. "Look," he began, holding up his hands as if to call for calm. "We're all adults here. I don't know what's going on between these two, but we can't let something like this ruin the flight. There's no reason for us to be caught up in this nonsense." Dr. Roberts' face tightened as she turned to look at him, her eyes filled with the same unwavering confidence that had fueled her response earlier. She wasn't going to let anyone belittle her stance now, especially not someone who hadn't witnessed everything that had happened. She had earned her place, not just on this flight, but in the world at large, and this new voice, this stranger, wasn't about to derail her resolve. But the man in the aisle didn't stop there. "Look," he continued, his voice growing more insistent, "we're all here to get from point A to point B. There's no reason to escalate this. So, let's just forget about it and move on." The man's words hit harder than Dr. Roberts expected. He wasn't dismissing the situation outright. Instead, he was trying to downplay it. The idea that everything could be forgotten felt wrong, like it erased the very thing she had been standing up for all along. The recognition of the injustice she had faced, the implications of what this man had said to her. This wasn't just some trivial squabble over a seat. This was about the very real consequences of bias and prejudice, something that so many people like her faced every single day. But there was more. The stranger's voice wasn't the only new disturbance. As the tension simmered, the original man, the one who had demanded that Dr. Roberts move, suddenly made a move. He lurched forward, breaking the silence with a final, desperate proclamation. "You people, you don't even get it," he said, louder this time, his words heavy with bitterness. "I've had enough of this. Every time someone tries to stand their ground, it's like the world has to stop. But you know what? It's not your world, and it's not your rules. You don't get to make everyone feel bad just because you want to be special." His words struck Dr. Roberts like a slap. For a brief moment, she was speechless. He had crossed a line that wasn't just about who sat where, but about the very essence of her identity. It was more than her career, her achievements, or even her place on this flight. It was about something more fundamental: respect. The way he had spoken to her, the way he had attempted to diminish her, was a reflection of something larger. A mindset that had existed for far too long. And just as Dr. Roberts felt her heart racing, something else happened, an unexpected plot twist that nobody had seen coming. The woman who had been standing at the front, the one who had stepped in earlier to defend Dr. Roberts, suddenly turned to face the man. She took a deep breath, and without warning, walked directly toward him. The entire cabin fell silent again. Everyone in the vicinity was waiting for her to speak, to make sense of her intentions. Was she about to reprimand the man? Was this going to be another heated exchange? But instead of addressing him directly, she took another step forward, leaning in close to Dr. Roberts. In a voice barely above a whisper, the woman said, "You're not the only one who's been overlooked." Dr. Roberts blinked, confused. The woman's words hung in the air, elusive, carrying an undertone that wasn't immediately clear. The passengers around them exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Dr. Roberts looked back at her, trying to understand what she meant. Was she referring to the man's behavior? Or was there more to this than met the eye? Before Dr. Roberts could respond, the woman turned back toward the man, her face a mask of determination. "What's your problem?" she asked sharply, her voice calm but laced with unmistakable intensity. The man, now visibly rattled, opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out. His shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, he appeared utterly defeated. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted once more, like a storm brewing. The woman had turned the tables, but in a way that no one had expected. And yet, just when it seemed that everything might fall apart, the unexpected happened. The man finally took a step back, his face a twisted mixture of anger and fear. He glanced at Dr. Roberts one last time, his eyes briefly meeting hers before he turned away. It was in that moment, that split second of tension, that the truth seemed to hang in the air. He was losing, but was it too late for him to understand the depth of his mistake? The passengers watched in anticipation, some unsure of what would happen next. Would the man leave the situation behind and accept the uncomfortable truth that Dr. Roberts and the woman had laid bare? Or was there more to this confrontation than anyone could have predicted? The story was far from over. and the stakes, with every passing moment, seemed to grow higher. The cabin was still, as if the very air had been sucked out. The man, now visibly defeated, took a step back from Dr. Roberts and the woman. His face had lost its earlier anger, replaced with a mask of confusion and discomfort. His hands were shaking slightly, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he might finally concede, finally realize the weight of his actions and words. The tension was so thick that it felt like even the hum of the plane's engines had quieted down. Dr. Roberts didn't flinch. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, her gaze unwavering. She had been through too much to let this moment pass without confronting it head-on. She had made her point, and now, it seemed, the man was left to wrestle with the consequences of his own actions. She was ready for this to be over, but part of her also knew that this wasn't just about winning the argument. For a moment, everything was still. The woman who had come to Dr. Roberts' side was waiting, as if she were holding her breath for the next move. The passengers around them were quiet now, eyes flicking back and forth between the two sides. Would the man give in, or would he double down? It seemed impossible for him to salvage any dignity, but human pride could be an unpredictable thing. And then, just when it seemed like the confrontation might dissipate into uncomfortable silence, the man did something unexpected. He turned on his heel and marched toward the back of the plane, muttering something under his breath. His face twisted with frustration, and though he didn't shout, the passengers could tell that he was trying to leave the scene without further confrontation. But Dr. Roberts wasn't done yet. "Is that it?" she called out after him, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The man froze for a moment, his back still turned to her. He didn't answer, but his body language said it all. He was retreating, but was it out of humility? Or was it out of sheer embarrassment? Either way, the energy had shifted. The cabin was no longer filled with tension. It was filled with relief. Dr. Roberts had held her ground, and in doing so, she had asserted something bigger than herself. She had shown that no one could diminish her worth, regardless of their position, status, or ignorance. But as the man walked to the back of the plane, the woman who had stepped forward earlier suddenly moved, quickly, toward Dr. Roberts. She approached her with a calmness that was almost unnerving, as though she were about to say something important. The woman's eyes met Dr. Roberts with a quiet intensity. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice low, but filled with sincerity. "You don't know how much this means to me." Dr. Roberts blinked, surprised by the words. "You don't need to thank me," she said, her voice still firm, but with a trace of warmth. "It wasn't just about me. It's about everyone who's had to fight for their space, for their voice." The woman nodded. "I know," she said. "That's why I couldn't stay silent." Dr. Roberts studied her for a moment, noticing the slight tension in her posture, the way she was holding herself, as though she was standing on the edge of something monumental. She had assumed this was just another passenger, someone who felt compelled to speak out in the moment. But there was something else, something deeper behind her eyes. And it wasn't until the woman took a deep breath and continued speaking that Dr. Roberts understood the full weight of what she was hearing. "I didn't want you to think I was just helping you because of what happened here today," the woman said, her voice growing more serious. "I know what it's like to be overlooked, to be underestimated, but I'm not just a bystander in all of this." Dr. Roberts felt a sharp pang of curiosity. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cautious now. The woman took a step closer, her eyes darting around, as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. "I'm a surgeon too," she said, the words hanging in the air for a moment, as if they were too big to say aloud. "But my career's been held back because of who I am. You know what I mean?" Dr. Roberts' eyes widened, realization dawning. The woman's words hit harder than anything that had been said in the entire confrontation. She wasn't just another passenger. It was like she had been standing there, waiting for a moment like this. Waiting for someone to speak up for what she couldn't say herself. The fight wasn't just Dr. Roberts' fight, it was the woman's fight too. And it was clear that there was a deeper, unspoken connection between them, one that transcended the immediate conflict. But before Dr. Roberts could respond, the woman smiled faintly and stepped back. "You did what I couldn't," she said quietly. "Thank you for showing me it's okay to fight back." And just like that, the moment that had felt so intensely personal was suddenly transformed. It wasn't just about one man, one confrontation. It was about a larger shared struggle. The woman wasn't just standing up for Dr. Roberts, she was standing up for herself, and for others like them who had spent their lives navigating a world that didn't always welcome them with open arms. As the woman walked away, leaving Dr. Roberts to process the magnitude of their conversation, the energy in the cabin shifted again. The passengers, who had been glued to the scene, seemed to exhale collectively. The man who had started it all had retreated, the flight attendants resumed their duties, and the cabin returned to a sort of uneasy calm. But the tension was still there, beneath the surface, as though everyone had just witnessed something larger than themselves. But the final twist came as Dr. Roberts sat back down in her seat, a mixture of satisfaction and confusion running through her mind. Curious, she reached for it and unfolded it carefully. On the paper was just one word, written in bold, shaky handwriting: *watch*. Dr. Roberts felt a chill run down her spine. Who had left this? And what did it mean? The mystery hung in the air, unanswered, as the plane continued its journey, heading toward its destination, while the story, and the deeper, hidden truths it contained, remained far from over. Dr. Roberts sat still, the piece of paper in her hand feeling like it weighed a ton. The word *watch* scrawled across it burned into her mind as she sat in the seat, her thoughts racing. Who had left it there? Was it the man who had started the confrontation, or perhaps someone else on the plane who had been watching from the sidelines? The word itself felt cryptic, loaded with meaning that wasn't immediately clear. What was she supposed to watch? And why now, after everything had seemingly calmed down? Her fingers tightened around the paper as she glanced around the cabin. It was quiet again, the usual hum of the plane filling the space, and the people around her had returned to their own business. Some were reading, others watching movies or chatting quietly. But Dr. Roberts couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. The battle she'd fought had been intense, but it had also felt like a small piece of a much bigger puzzle. She had stood up for herself, for her place in this world, and for the dignity she deserved. But there was more to it, more that she needed to understand. Her mind returned to the woman who had stood up for her earlier. The one who had spoken with such quiet strength, revealing her own struggles and her own hidden fight. She had said, "You did what I couldn't." Those words echoed in Dr. Roberts' mind, and in that moment she realized something profound. It wasn't just about the man on the plane, or the confrontation over a first-class seat. It was about a shared experience, about the way people who looked like her, people who often went unnoticed or were diminished, had to fight not only for space in society, but also for the space to be heard. She had done something for herself, yes, but she had also done something for every woman, every person who had ever been underestimated. But the message on the paper still hung over her. *watch*. It wasn't just a word, it was a command. It felt like a warning. And as she stared out the plane window, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, something she had missed, something she hadn't quite pieced together yet. Then, just as the plane began its descent toward the destination, Dr. Roberts noticed something. The man who had initially caused all the chaos was now sitting quietly by himself, his head buried in a book, trying to avoid eye contact with anyone. She wondered if he even realized the impact his words had on others. Or had he simply retreated out of embarrassment? Whatever his reasoning, he had been silenced, his pride shattered in front of everyone. But for Dr. Roberts, the confrontation wasn't just about shutting him down. It was about standing up for herself and for the dignity of every person who had ever been dismissed or belittled. The woman who had helped her earlier was still seated a few rows ahead, her own expression calm, though there was something different in the way she carried herself now. She had been given a new sense of strength. In their brief exchange, Dr. Roberts had seen something change in her, something deep and lasting. She had found her voice, perhaps for the first time in a long time. That, more than anything, was the victory Dr. Roberts felt in her heart. As the plane touched down and the passengers slowly began to gather their things, the man who had caused the conflict stood up, looking around with unease. He avoided eye contact with Dr. Roberts, his face flushing as he hurried to leave the plane. He passed by Dr. Roberts without a word, but this time there was no arrogance in his posture, no defiance, just a quiet retreat into the anonymity of the airport terminal. Dr. Roberts watched him go, a small sense of closure settling over her. She didn't need an apology from him. She didn't need his approval. What she had done was more than enough. She had made her point, and in doing so, she had taken back her space, her dignity, and her voice. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight not for recognition, but for the simple right to be seen and heard. As she gathered her own things and prepared to disembark, the woman who had helped her approached once again, this time with a smile. "I just wanted to say, thank you again," she said, her voice steady, yet full of warmth. "I don't think I would have had the courage to speak up if you hadn't." Dr. Roberts smiled, a sense of camaraderie passing between them. "You're welcome," she replied. The woman nodded, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Maybe next time, we can stand together." Dr. Roberts nodded, feeling the strength of their shared experience. It wasn't over. The fight for equality, for recognition, for respect, it would always continue. But moments like these, when two people connected over something deeper than the surface level, made all the difference. They were allies in a fight that went beyond this one confrontation. And perhaps in that small moment, they had given each other the strength to keep going. As Dr. Roberts stepped off the plane and into the terminal, she couldn't help but think about the word that had been left for her. *watch*. The message had seemed cryptic, but now, looking back, it made more sense. She had been watching not just the man who had challenged her, but also watching herself. She had been learning how to fight, how to stand her ground, how to push past the moments of doubt and fear. And that was the most important lesson of all. In the end, Dr. Roberts realized that it wasn't just about the confrontation or the drama. It was about the quiet victories, the ones that went unnoticed by most, but carried the deepest meaning. She had won her place in the world, not because she had to prove something to anyone, but because she had proven it to herself. And as she walked through the terminal, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready. Ready to watch, ready to fight, and most of all, ready to stand tall.